The first time the widow rolled a rusted metal container down from the hilltop, it shrieked like a dying beast and woke the valley at dawn. Crows scattered, dogs barked, and a pair of ranchers half a mile east leaned out their window, stared at the dusty commotion below, and said just loud enough for their wives to hear, "God help her. She's building a coffin for her cows." At the center of that scraping, grinding ruckus stood Clara Dalton, 51 years old, veil still folded in her pocket from her husband's funeral the previous spring, and jaw set like bedrock. Her boots cracked frost as she walked the ridging, guiding a team of mules as they dragged a chain-wrapped, dented shipping container inch by inch toward the narrow slope above her property. The hillside looked like it should have swallowed the whole thing. But Clara had spent weeks digging and grading, banking soil into an incline with wheelbarrows, not caring how many times she slipped and bloodied her knees down in the flats. Folks whispered, "Poor thing's lost it. Think she's in some city port. Barn's supposed to breathe. That metal will freeze solid come January." They didn't know she'd run calculations, didn't know she'd studied airflow insulation, and the strange way steel radiated heat when properly buried. Didn't know she'd written letters to an uncle back east, begging for access to surplus army manuals on container bunkers and makeshift storage depots. And didn't know the real reason she was racing to finish before snowfall. Because a shadow of winter was coming, and this one would not be kind. The previous barn had caught fire in spring, a storm lantern kicked over by a spooked calf. Clara's husband Walter had died trying to wrestle the last cow from the blaze. By the time the town marshal arrived, the barn was a black husk. Walter was gone and Clara stood in the smoke, holding nothing but the bell collar from the family's last heifer. They buried him 2 days later. And on the third day, Clara walked the land and started pacing it in hard boot-worn steps. People expected her to rebuild the old barn the same way, log, timber frame, something natural. She had other ideas. The containers came one by one. Some were already on her property, rusting from the mining years, forgotten at the edge of a creek bed. Others she bought for a pittance from a scrapyard to towns over. Every few days, Clara hitched her team and dragged another hulk of steel into the clearing behind the house. Each time, more neighbors wandered up the road to stare. "This ain't Chicago." A man named Merle Sutter called out one day, arms folded, as he leaned on his horse. She didn't look at him. "Steel freezes worse than wood. You'll trap the cold inside like a damn meat locker." Clara lifted a pry bar, wedged it under the container's corner, and didn't say a word. "Suit yourself," Merle said with a smirk, but his voice trailed off a bit when she stood upright and stared at him. Dirt-streaked and sunburned, her hands bleeding through canvas gloves. He rode off without another word. The build wasn't pretty. She cut doors out of the sides with a second-hand acetylene torch, welded hinges with a kit her husband had left behind, stacked hay bales as insulation between the containers and framed over them with sod and tarps to keep the snow off. She ran, salvaged stovepipes from the corners, sealed gaps with mud, and drilled vent holes lined with burlap. People laughed harder when she started funneling gutter pipes from the house to the top of the barn. "Draining your roof into your cows now, Clara," one of the township boys jeered. She didn't answer, but what none of them realized was this. The runoff melted snow. It trickled through a clay pipe she dug that coiled through the barn floor like a serpent. A buried water system, primitive radiant heating, her own design. Every night she scrawled improvements in the margins of a spiral notebook, some based on books, others from trial and error, and always she thought of Walter. What he would have said, what he might have built if he were here. How he might have laughed at the sound of wind whistling through a steel hull and said, "Hell of a ship you're sailing, Clara." The first cold snap came early. October was barely over when frost crept thick over the valley. A thin snow-dusted roofs, men cursed as their hinges stuck, and cattle breath steamed from half-frozen nostrils. Inside her barn, Clara stood beside a rusted container wall, listening to the creaks and groans of contracting steel. The heat from the buried pipe was faint but steady. She opened one of the interior crates and let the cows shuffle inside, their hooves clacking softly on straw-padded metal. She'd placed them in the central unit, the best insulated, and watched as steam slowly rose from their bodies, condensation, forming on the cold ceiling. It wasn't warm, but it was survivable, and she'd keep improving it. Then November hit. A storm rolled over the western ridge with a wind that sounded like a banshee. Snow hammered the valley, roofs cracked, fences vanished under drifts. A family 6 miles out got trapped in their home for 3 days when their porch caved in. The postman's mule froze standing up, and Clara fed her cows from a hatch. In the side of the barn, she sealed the main doors with an extra tarp, adjusted the flue vents to trap more heat, and wrapped her own cabin in a layer of hay she'd stacked against the outside like cladding. Her kitchen dropped to 41, but never lower. Her firewood stayed dry. Her water barrels didn't freeze. She checked on her cows 3 times a day, hands chapped, steam rising from their nostrils, and by the second week of the storm, something strange began to happen. The same neighbors who'd mocked her began showing up at the edge of her fence. It started with Merle. His barn roof had collapsed under 2 feet of snow. He showed up with his hat in hand and said, "You still got that spare stall, Clara?" She nodded once, then came the Whitman boys, both trembling with sheep huddled behind them like shadows. "Our troughs froze. Yours ain't right." Clara opened the side hatch. "Let the warmth roll out. Let them look." A day later, the preacher's daughter came with her last goat wrapped in a quilt. Each one who mocked her came knocking now. And Clara, though she never smiled, let them in. She wasn't building a coffin. She was building a refuge. But the storm wasn't finished yet. And the real test, the one she hadn't planned for, the one no neighbor expected, came not from snow, but from what the storm did to the town's only bridge and the boy who went missing after. The river didn't freeze clean, it cracked slow, uneven. First a skin, then a web. Then a solid-looking shell that hid the black gurgling current still roaring underneath. The townsfolk knew better than to cross it early. But when the storm took out the ridge road and the mountain pass clogged with snow taller than a horse, the only path between the valley and the railway depot was the small wooden bridge at Sparrow's Ford, narrow, old, and already leaning on the morning of the 9th day of the freeze. Something snapped. The sheriff, Cal Dutton, heard it from Town Square. A low groan followed by a crack like the earth itself yawning open. He ran toward the sound with 3 others, and arrived just in time to see the far span of the bridge slump sideways and vanish into the icy current, taking half a dozen fence posts with it. Word spread fast. By dusk, every house east of the river knew they were cut off. Supply sleds couldn't get through. No grain, no flour, no dried meats or coal. And in that same breathless art of realization, someone shouted that the Harper boy, Jacob, had gone missing, 12 years old, last seen heading toward the ridge alone. Clara heard the knock just after sunset. The wind was so loud she thought it might have been a branch at first. Then came the second knock, firmer, followed by 3 rapid taps. She opened the door to find Henry Whitman standing there panting. Face rhymed with frost. His beard looked iced. His eyes wide. "Kid's gone," he said. "The Harper boy folks think he tried crossing west, maybe to see his uncle, maybe just lost. Clara, they need help." He didn't need to say why he was here. She stepped back and grabbed her coat, tucked the revolver into her belt, not for shooting but for signaling, wrapped her scarf tight, and grabbed her mule's reins. "I'm coming." The search party met at the tree line near the blown-over pine. That marked the old shortcut to Sparrow's Ford. There were 6 men, 1 woman, and a child barely older than Jacob. Bundled thick and trying to be brave, Clara didn't ask questions. She just moved, listened, and thought. Wind tore at their voices. Tracks were scarce, blown over too fast to read, but Clara scanned the woods with a tracker's eye. The boy wouldn't have gone straight for the bridge, not if the wind had started. Already, he'd have looked for shelter, maybe one of the old hunting lintos near the ridge line. She said as much, and the group split in 3. Clara took the eastern rise alone. It took her 2 hours to find the linto. Another 10 minutes to find the small frost-nipped bundle curled inside. Stiff with cold, but still breathing, Jacob, face pale, lips blue, eyes barely open. She wrapped him in her coat, tucked him against her chest, and moved like the devil was on her heels because cold didn't forgive slowness. Not at 12 below zero, not when snow came sideways. And even the trees seemed to groan from the weight of it. She got him back just before midnight. The doctor wasn't reachable, roads too slick, town too far, so Clara didn't wait. She cleared the central stall of her barn. The same one she built for her strongest cow now moved to a side unit and laid the boy down on a bed of straw layered over warm steel. She fetched the kettle, kept water boiling, burned through half her coal stock to keep the room above freezing. She hung blankets from the rafters to trap heat and laid hot stones near his feet, swapped them every hour. Slowly, color returned. The other families gathered outside waiting. No one asked if they could help. They just did. One chopped kindling, another ladled stew. 2 women repaired the stove pipe seal Clara had patched with wire last week. It wasn't just a barn now. It was the town's heart. By morning, Jacob sat up, shivering but alive. The doctor, who had made it as far as the river but no further, wept when he heard the news. They said it was a freezer, the boy whispered that afternoon, staring at the barn walls. But it's warm in here. Clara didn't answer, just pressed a hand to his forehead and adjusted the blanket. Outside, the snow kept falling, barrels crusted with ice. Smoke curled from Clara's stovepipe like a banner. And then came the flood. Not water, not yet, but need. People came in pairs, in families, carrying sacks, blankets, chickens. One old woman came dragging a piglet in a wheelbarrow. Another, from 2 hills south, offered Clara her wedding ring in exchange for stall space. I don't want your ring, Clara said softly. Just your hands, the woman wept. Then helped build a windbreak. By week's end, Clara's barn held 7 families, nearly 24 animals, a makeshift nursery, 2 grain bins, and a barrel stove at each corner, welded from scrap and belching. Just enough warmth to make the air bearable. Every day, Clara updated her notebook, airflow, condensation rates, heat retention, but more and more. The scribbles gave way to new sections, names, chores, births, losses, hopes. This wasn't just survival anymore. This was a community inside a barn of steel. But hardship wasn't done with them. One night, the wind changed. Howled so hard it ripped one of the tarp seams open, pulling the side flap of a container half loose. The temperature plummeted. Hay froze. Cattle stirred, then panicked. Clara ran through the chaos barefoot, dragging a tarp. Hammering it back down with frost-bitten fingers, she screamed orders, shoved glowing coals into the cow stalls, bled from her knuckles, sealing gaps with rags and glue. By dawn, her hands had cracked, her lips bled, but the barn still stood, and not a soul inside had frozen. That morning, Merle found her sitting against the barn wall, eyes closed, breath fogging the air in slow puffs. He said her name once, twice, then knelt and said quietly, "We were wrong." She looked at him. "No one should have built this barn," he continued, voice trembling. "But you did, and now none of us would be here without it. Without you." She didn't answer, but she took the hammer he offered, and they patched the roof together. Then came the final blow. Not snow, not cold, but fire. 2 towns east, a lightning strike hit a homestead roof. The blaze took 3 cabins. Sparks traveled fast even in snow. Ember carried by dry wind over powdery drifts. A stray gust reached the northern ridge where Clara's oldest outbuilding stood. Half buried under hay, someone screamed flames. Clara ran. The fire hadn't reached the barn, but it would. She grabbed her spade, kicked open a trench she'd started digging months earlier, but never finished. A firebreak. She screamed for buckets, for snow, for water, for anything. People came running. They shoveled, poured, shouted. The edge of flame hissed and died. The barn smoked but did not catch because of the dirt wall, because of Clara. That night they stood in silence around the central stall. Jacob handed her a drawing, shaky pencil marks on old newspaper, a picture of the barn, square and proud, with a sun drawn behind it and little stick figures all around. "You saved us," he said. Clara held the paper in both hands, didn't speak, and thought of Walter, But deep beneath the snowpack, cracks were forming. The river was changing and the thaw would bring more than just water. It wasn't the cold that finally did it. It was the thaw. By late January, the valley had survived 7 weeks of storms. 7 weeks of smoke-blackened skies, sub-zero nights, and ice crusts that snapped under every step like bone. The barn, Clara's welded together half-buried maze of steel, had held, not without strain, not without panic, but it had held her design. Scorned by the town in the fall, had outlasted every timber structure in the surrounding miles. But even steel has its enemies. And as the temperature inched above freezing for the first time in nearly 2 months, the snow on the ridgelines didn't melt, it collapsed. Ice broke like slate under boots, the river swelled, and a wall of slush, water, and uprooted branches came roaring down from the southern slope like a beast uncloaked by fog. No one heard it until it was too close. By the time the first crashing echo reached Clara's land, the ice surge had already swallowed half the lower field. Clara had been in the barn when it started, checking the vent seals again, rearranging the straw near the goats to keep them dry. She heard a strange low groan like a cave caving in beneath her. Then a distant crashing that didn't sound like wind or thunder or anything she'd heard all winter. Her eyes snapped up. The others must have heard it too, because within moments, the barn filled with startled voices, people glancing to one another, parents clutching children, old men craning their necks toward the shaking walls. Then the lookout Benny Lyle, the one-armed woodcutter who'd been perched on the hilltop for warmth, shouted down, "Flood!" The container barn wasn't in the floodplain. That had been part of Clara's original planning. She'd picked her site carefully, a small plateau up from the creek, earth packed hard and lined with a drainage ditch she dug in the fall. But what was coming down wasn't a flood in the normal sense. It was a river breaking loose, a frozen snake sloughing its skin and dragging boulders with it. And the lower pasture where Merle Sutter had his tool shed, where the Whitman boys had stacked their last cord of wood, where Clara herself had once grazed the family's old oxen, was already gone. Trees snapped, fences vanished. A water trough the size of a horse flew through the air like driftwood. She had minutes, maybe less, out. She shouted, "Everyone outside, move." No one argued, that was the rule. Now when Clara shouted, "You moved," they grabbed coats, mittens, blankets. Clara shouldered to toddlers into her arms and thrust them into waiting hands. She shoved open the secondary hatch, pointed uphill, and began waving people toward it. Top ridge, don't stop. Water was already rushing through the north break. It hit the container's outer flank with a boom like cannon fire. Steel groaned, the earth buckled. But the barn held. The outer containers were half buried, sealed into compacted clay and wrapped in tarps reinforced with stone. The flood clawed at it, but the building sat tight in the land like a tick in skin. Clara dashed back inside against every instinct and dragged out the Harper boys' drawing, now stuck under a cow's feed bucket. She stuffed it into her coat and turned to flee again. That's when the cow screamed. Bessie, the old milker, was stuck. Her rear leg had slipped through a soft patch where straw had covered an unfinished drainage grate. The animal kicked and flailed, panicked, tongue foaming. Clara lunged. It wasn't heroic. It was reflex. She wrapped her arms around the neck, hauled with every muscle left in her starved frame, and screamed for help. None came. The others were already gone, and still she pulled. The water slammed the wall again. The cow lurched forward, half lifted by Clara's effort and half by sheer terror. Her hoof came free with a sickening snap. Something broke, but she was moving, stumbling, staggering toward the hatch. Clara chased her out. Snow splashed underfoot. Mud now, not ice, brown water. Boiling downhill, the field she'd sown for oats last year looked like a swamp of shattered glass. But the barn still stood, and Clara still moved. 2 days passed. The thaw was quick, violent, but short-lived. Once the surge passed, a new freeze set in, locking the water in place like shattered windows suddenly glazed again. The barn was battered. The lowest container had shifted an inch sideways, its door frame now tilted at a drunken angle. The heating pipes were clogged with silt. Two tarps had ripped, one vent was gone entirely, and one of the cows limped so badly she had to be laid down and hand-fed for days. But no one had died, no animals lost, and still, miraculously, inside those walls, the temperature stayed just above freezing. Everyone in town knew the truth now. The barn had saved them again. In the weeks that followed, something shifted. Clara no longer heard whispers behind her back. No more muttered jokes from passing wagons, no sideways glances. At the trading post, instead, people stopped her on the road. "Ma'am, do you think I could weld a stovepipe the way you did?" "Clara, if I bury a container halfway like yours, will the roof hold snow? Could you maybe help us build one, too?" She helped them. She drew diagrams on flour sacks, lent out her torch, oversaw a welding line in Merle's blacksmith shop. When she spoke, people took notes. When she pointed, they moved. And when a letter arrived in spring, stamped from the Army Depot to States East, addressed to Mrs. Clara Dalton, inventor of the cold barn design, the town passed it around with awe. Inside were photos, official diagrams, stamped commendations. From a forward operating logistics division, apparently, someone had heard of Clara's bunker barn through one of her old letters, and shared it during a winter logistics planning meeting. They wanted to send someone out to study it. Clara didn't answer the letter. She didn't care about military praise. She only cared about the next storm because the mountains weren't done with them yet. That summer, Clara tore down the most damaged container and rebuilt it higher, reinforcing the welds and adding a sand wall against runoff. She trained two girls in town to weld. She installed a second drainage pipe, started teaching every boy over 10 how to seal a vent, read a thermometer, and test for carbon buildup. By fall, 3 other families had started their own container barns, not as large, not as well built, but modeled on Clara's. And every one of them stood proud under the first snow. The town changed. Fewer laughs, more hands. When Clara walked through town square, folks stood aside, not because she was a curiosity, but because they knew, they remembered, and they were still here because of her. Then one morning, deep in November, Clara found a strange package on her porch. Wrapped in canvas, no note, just a single tag with her name and a burned-in sketch of a star. Inside was a set of blueprints, military-grade, new designs, updated specs for container-based shelters marked with red ink in the margins. Based on Dalton variation, she stared at it a long time, then added it to her notebook. Later that day, Jacob, now 14, growing fast, came to ask if he could help add another pipe to the barn. She handed him a spade. "Start digging." He smiled and she watched him go, heart heavy and full. The valley still froze, storm still came, but Clara's barn still stood. And this time, when the wind came howling down the ridge, people didn't run. They gathered, they lit the stoves, and they sang. Not loud, not foolish, but together. Inside the steel bones of what had once been a joke, and was now a sanctuary. By the second winter, no one laughed at Clara's barn. They measured their own roofs by its slope. They timed their firewood stacking by her early autumn cues. And when she tacked a handwritten notice to the frame post outside her gate, welding lessons resume October 4th. 5 men, 3 women, and a 12-year-old girl showed up with gloves, notepads, and borrowed goggles. But the truth was, Clara didn't feel proud. She felt haunted. Not by ghosts exactly, but by the burden of knowing what it meant to stay warm while others froze. She'd seen how fast things broke when winter wanted them broken. She'd held dying calves, hauled men out of collapsed roofs, shoveled snow until her arms went numb. And she knew better than most that it would all come again. Worse, sharper. Steel was strong, but winters were patient, and patience beat steel in the end. So she prepared again. She started by reinforcing the drainage trenches. She widened the fire breaks. She added a second ventilation chimney to the south container, cutting through the steel with sparks flying like fireflies in the dark. She worked until her breath wheezed and her joints ached, and she had to sit with her back against the barn wall just to keep her legs from giving out. Still, she got up. Still, she worked. In November, A letter arrived with a wax seal and a crest Clara didn't recognize. It was stamped from some office of Western settlement architecture and co-signed by a military engineer. They were requesting permission to formally study the Dalton Cold Barn model. Site visit to be conducted during active winter conditions, the letter read, to assess structural integrity and survival suitability for remote outposts. Clara blinked at the paper, then folded it in half and stuck it under her coffee tin. No one needed to study what they lived. The valley knew. The cold had already conducted its own test, and she passed. But the town wasn't ready. Not for what December brought, not for that storm. It started slow like most betrayals. Early snow in late November, nothing strange. Just thick flurries and a sky gone slate gray for days, then came the real freeze. Harder than anything the last year had thrown at them, horses broke through ice trying to drink. Axes snapped from the cold, one man's rifle shattered when he dropped it, metal splintering at the stock. Then the wind came, not just bitter or biting, but wrong. It came from the east, unnatural, swirling down from a canyon that hadn't blown air since anyone in town could remember. It hit like a wall and didn't stop. Every crevice screamed. Every crack bled cold, and in the midst of it, something worse happened. The Davidson twins, 6 years old, pale, and always smiling, vanished. It happened the morning after the wind shifted. Their mother had stepped outside to fetch water. Gone 5 minutes. When she came back, the girls were gone. Doors still closed, blankets still warm, just gone. The town panicked. Clara didn't. She stood quietly by the edge of the barn's main entrance, scanning the fields. She knew where she'd look. The snow had been blowing sideways all night. If the girls had gone out the back window, chasing some imagined sound or fantasy, the wind would have pushed them west toward the draw, a natural trench, a snow trap. She took her lantern and went. The trench was a quarter-mile out, hidden behind brush, just enough of a depression in the land to catch what the wind discarded. Clara slid down the first embankment, her lamp swinging low. She didn't call out, didn't waste breath, just listened. The hush of snow, the creak of ice, then movement, a flicker, a whimper. She turned hard to her right, dropped to her knees, and found the twins half buried under a snowbank, clinging to one another, lips blue. One sock between the two of them. She didn't ask why, didn't scold. She wrapped them in her coat, yanked them to her chest, and carried them back through the snow with wind clawing at her eyes like needles. Back at the barn, the neighbors cleared space. The barn was different. Now, still the same bones, steel and straw, welded vents, and glowing stove barrels. But it had become instinctual. Everyone knew their role, knew what to grab, how to heat stones, when to boil water. Clara passed off the girls to waiting. Arms, blankets appeared, broth was made, fire stirred the barn. This machine of survival pulsed like a living thing. The twins survived. But something in Clara didn't sleep right afterward. She sat up that night beside the barn's central stove, staring at the flickering glow against corrugated walls, the hum of the metal, the wind clawing outside, the steady hiss of steam from the water barrel. She thought of Walter, of how he died in fire, of how these girls nearly died in ice, of how she kept building while the land kept trying to unbuild. She wondered if she'd ever stop. By midwinter, the barn held 37 people, 12 animals, 6 fires. One baby born in the back corner under a tarp canopy to a woman whose husband hadn't made it back from the mountain pass in time. Clara helped deliver the child, cut the cord with a hunting knife, held the baby when the mother fainted from blood loss. The child cried once, then settled. She named her Clara. Outside, the world kept cracking. The storm wasn't natural anymore. That's what people said in hushed voices. It had gone on too long. The wind was wrong. The sun hadn't pierced the clouds in 27 days. They marked it with charcoal on the barn wall, 27 black slashes beside the stove. Then on day 28, something happened, a low rumble, a tremor, and then silence. The next morning, they opened the hatch and the sky was clear, bright, painfully bright. The wind had stopped. Snow glittered across the valley like glass, and every cabin in town was either buried, shattered, or frost blackened except the barn. It stood tall, steam rose from the vents. Children's voices echoed from within, and Clara, eyes squinting against the new sun, leaned on the doorway like a ship's captain on the deck of something seaworthy. A vessel of survival. People said a lot of things after that storm. They said it was the worst freeze in 50 years. They said it was the mountains reminding them who ruled. They said it was a curse, a reckoning, or a warning, but they also said something else. They said Clara's barn beat it. And when spring came, the High Commissioner from the territory office came riding up the trail with 2 guards and a clerk looking for the Dalton cold barn. He didn't find some mad woman hiding in a box of rusted containers. He found a town gathered around the only building still standing, living, thriving. Clara didn't offer tea. She didn't wear her best dress. She didn't read the certificate the man handed her, declaring her structure an engineering marvel and offering her a stipend to support continued civil development in extreme climates. She just nodded once and said, "Winter's coming again," then turned back toward the barn and began patching the next roof. The spring thaw didn't bring rest. It brought mud and collapse and reckoning. Old fences fell in soggy lines. Half the ridge road sloughed into the canyon, taking to wagon loads of limestone with it. What cabins had survived the winter now warped and sagged, their beams swollen, joints unseated. Piles of firewood, once so carefully stacked, lay black and rotted under the weight of melted snow, now too wet to burn. But Clara's barn still stood. She patched what needed patching. She redredged seams the flood had exposed. She shoveled out the silty sediment that had packed under the cow stalls. But the bones held, the walls held, the heat held. It was ugly, rusted, dented in places, but whole, and come spring, it wasn't just a barn anymore. It was the town's barn. The townsfolk didn't call it that, not officially. No one dared touch Clara's name on it. But when they referred to the barn, they all meant hers. When a new family arrived from the Northern Trail, run out of their homestead by fire and seeking shelter, it was Clara's barn they pointed to. She'll know what to do. She always does. She built through the worst of it. By summer, 3 more container structures had gone up. One belonged to the preacher, who turned it into a shared schoolhouse, insulated, warm, and lit by salvaged glass from the ruined church windows. Another out by the East Ridge became a feed shed for the Whitmans. The third was half buried like Clara's original design, built by a widow named Sophie, who'd lost 2 sons in the ice storm and now refused to let a single goat freeze again. Clara didn't offer praise. She didn't say much at all. But when Sophie's rooftops tore in a July windstorm, it was Clara who showed up before sunrise to weld the frame and reinforce the bolts with salvaged railroad pins. When Sophie asked why, Clara just shrugged. "Steel's not strong unless it's connected," she said. Same with us. The recognition kept coming, even when Clara tried to ignore it. A photographer from the Territorial Gazette arrived in September, tried to take a picture of the barn. Clara waved him off. "You want a photo?" she muttered. "Take it in January. See if you're still standing then." Still, the story ran. They called her the Iron Widow, said she'd turned the tide of frontier engineering, that her design had redefined survival, that her stubbornness had sparked a cold shelter revolution. But none of that mattered to Clara. She didn't build to impress, she built to withstand. Then came the third winter, the hardest yet, not because of the cold, but because it didn't end. Snow began in October and didn't stop until March. Not heavy at first, just steady, relentless, like a quiet drum that beat every day. Cold mornings turned to frozen weeks, firewood ran low, livestock grew thin. Even the valley's more seasoned ranchers muttered that they'd never seen anything like it. But this time, no one waited until they were desperate. They came early. They brought food, blankets, extra tools. They came not to beg, but to build before the worst hit. The barn had already expanded, 3 new containers added, forming a horseshoe that opened south for sunlight. One turned into a proper infirmary complete with a cot and supply shelf. Another became a kitchen fitted with a stove welded by the town's 2 newest apprentices, boys who'd once called her crazy behind her back. and now followed her every instruction with notebook in hand. And in the center, a stove as wide as a wagon axle built from a converted water tank, vented through 3 chimneys and crowned with a welded iron ring to hang pots from. That winter the barn hosted 45 people. A child learned to walk on its dirt floor. An old man died peacefully beside the south stove, surrounded by warmth and prayer. No one froze, no one starved. By February, someone stenciled letters onto the east container wall using whitewash and a chisel. Clarara's house. Clarara snorted when she saw it, but she didn't wipe it off. Then in April, after the Thor, the letter came stamped with a new seal, this time Imperial Post Washington Office, a formal invitation. The Dalton structure has been selected for replication as part of the 1889 Western Shelter Project. Your design has directly influenced the survival architecture initiatives planned for new territories. We would like you to join as a senior advisor to the program. She stared at the envelope a long time, read the letter again, then looked out over the barnyard. Cows lowing, children laughing, wind through steel vents, smoke curling from 6 chimneys. She folded the letter, tucked it behind the kettle, and didn't answer. 1 week later, Jacob Harper, now 17, taller than Clarara by a head and lean as a fence post, approached her by the barn's north wall. He helped her build the last container, had welded his name into a hidden panel on the frame. He stood there a long time, hat in hand, looking nervous. "What is it?" she asked. He swallowed. "I've been thinking I want to try building one myself. For real, out east, maybe with Sophie's nephew. He's got land, wants to try homesteading." Clarara looked at him. "You know how cold it gets out there?" He nodded. "I remember. You know what breaks first." He nodded again. "The seams." She grunted. "Then go," she said, "and don't build it pretty. Build it so it won't die." He smiled, eyes misting. "I learned from the best." By the 4th winter, 12 Dalton-style barns dotted the valley, each slightly different, each bearing traces of Clarara's principles. Buried bases, radiant pipe trenches, multi-directional vents, her fingerprints, iron-shaped on every bolt. Children born inside those walls would grow up never knowing what it meant to freeze in the dark. And when they asked where the design came from, they'd hear the story about the widow who'd built a barn from rust and resolve, about how the neighbors laughed, about how winter came and how the barn never fell. Clarara passed away in her sleep the following summer. Sun high, field quiet, one hand resting on her lap, still calloused from a life of work. They didn't bury her in the churchyard. They laid her to rest beneath the first container she ever dragged down the hill, the one she welded by hand, where the first cow had calved and the first child had survived the freeze. They wrapped her in canvas and laid her on straw and sealed the stall shut. And above the door they carved a new name, Widow of Steel. The barn still stands. A little more rust, a little more patchwork, but still warm, still home, still humming, with the breath of those who survived, because one woman didn't wait for permission, because she built, because she knew.